Andrew did not hesitate. He ripped the engagement ring off Zara's finger so violently she felt the skin tear. Before she could speak, he snatched the microphone from the officiant's hand. The sharp squeal of feedback cut through the chapel like a scream. "I can't do this," Andrew said, his voice echoing off marble walls. "I won't marry someone like you, Zara. I never should have agreed to this." The chapel exploded into gasps. Zara stood frozen at the altar in her custom gown, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat as the man she had molded herself for destroyed her in front of Seoul's elite. Camera phones lifted slowly. Whispers erupted like wildfire. At the back of the chapel, a man dressed in a sharp black suit stood perfectly still. Korean, broad-shouldered. A subtle tattoo peeked above his collar. He held a bouquet of white roses and his eyes, dark, unreadable, never left Zara. He watched her with a calm intensity, as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Andrew threw the microphone onto the altar and strode toward the exit. Zara's body moved before her mind could stop it. She ran after him, her heels clicking frantically against polished stone, tears streaming down her face. She was 3 steps from the doors when a hand, firm, unyielding, closed around her wrist. "Don't." The voice was low, controlled, final. Zara spun around, her vision still blurred with tears. The man in black stood behind her, his expression unreadable but his grip absolute. "Let me go," she choked out, trying to twist free. I need to talk to him." "No," the man said, and the quiet certainty in his tone sliced through her panic like a blade. "You don't need to chase a man who just humiliated you in front of hundreds of people. You don't need to beg him to stay." He paused, his gaze drilling into hers. "You need to let him walk." "Who are you?" Zara's voice cracked, rising with desperation and confusion. "Why are you stopping me?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he released her wrist and turned to face the chapel. Every single guest was staring at them now. Their faces blurred together, shock, scandal, barely concealed thrill at the spectacle unfolding before them. The man moved past Zara with a fluid, predatory grace that made people instinctively shift in their seats. He walked down the aisle toward the altar, and Zara found herself following him, pulled forward as if caught in his gravitational field. He ascended the steps to the altar. The officiant, who had been paralyzed in shock, stumbled backward. The man stopped in the exact spot where Andrew had stood moments before, and he turned to face Zara. He extended his hand toward her, palm up. An invitation, a command. Zara stared at him, her mind utterly blank, unable to comprehend what was happening. This stranger, this man she had never seen before, was standing at her altar, holding out his hand like he had every right to be there. "Come here," he said quietly, and something in his voice, something absolute, made her obey. She climbed the steps on trembling legs, her hands shaking as she placed hers in his. His palm was warm, roughened with scars she couldn't see, and his fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that contradicted the dangerous authority radiating from every inch of him. He turned to face the congregation, keeping her hand firmly in his, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the chapel without him needing to raise it. "I will marry her instead," he said. The words landed like a detonation. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The entire chapel seemed suspended in disbelief, every guest frozen, waiting to see if this was real or some fever dream they were all sharing. Zara's breath hitched. Her tear-streaked face turned toward him in shock. And then, the chapel doors slammed open. Andrew came storming back in, his face white with rage. The feedback from the microphone was still ringing in Zara's ears, a high-pitched scream that matched the silent wail in her chest. Andrew's retreating back was a blur of black fabric through her tears. He had just stripped her of her dignity with the same ease one might peel a label off a bottle. "Andrew," she choked out, her voice cracking. Her heavy silk train hissed against the marble floor as she hiked up her skirts, her legs trembling but determined. She had to reach him. She had to ask why. She was 3 steps into her descent from the altar when a hand, firm, cool, and immovable, closed around her wrist. "Don't," a voice commanded. It wasn't a shout, but it carried a weight that seemed to anchor the entire chaotic room. Zara spun around, ready to lash out at whoever was stopping her, but the words died in her throat. Standing before her was a man who looked like he had been carved from shadow and obsidian. He was tall, his presence so dominant that the gasping wedding guests seemed to fade into a gray blur. He wore a suit of midnight charcoal that fit him with lethal precision, and as he moved, the collar shifted to reveal the dark, intricate ink of a tattoo climbing his neck like a silent warning. In his other hand, he held a bouquet of white roses, their petals pristine and untouched by the carnage of the moment. "Let me go," Zara whispered, though her struggle had already ceased. "I have to." "He's leaving." "Let him walk," the man said. His eyes were a deep, piercing mahogany locked onto hers with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. He didn't look at the cameras or the whispering crowd, he looked only at her. "You are moving toward a man who just humiliated you. Why would you run toward your own destruction?" "You don't understand," she sobbed, a single tear tracing a path through her makeup. "I understand better than you think, Zara," he said, and the way he spoke her name with a calm, possessive familiarity sent a shiver down her spine. He stepped closer, invading her space until she could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold rain. He was a predator in a sanctuary, yet in his presence, the stinging shame of Andrew's abandonment began to numb. "Who are you?" she asked, her breath hitching. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her to where Andrew had frozen near the exit, his face pale and sweating under the weight of the stranger's gaze. The man in black leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, melodic vibration meant only for her. "I am the man who is going to make sure you never have to chase anyone ever again." The silence that followed his words was heavy, a suffocating blanket that lasted only a heartbeat before the man in black began to move. Cha Du-hyun did not rush. He walked with the steady, rhythmic pace of someone who already owned the room. Every step he took toward the altar seemed to pull the oxygen from the air, drawing the gaze of every stunned socialite and camera lens away from the retreating groom and toward his own towering silhouette. He reached the steps where Zara stood trembling. Andrew had stopped near the doors, his face a ghostly mask of shock, his mouth hanging open as he watched the stranger invade the space he had just abandoned. Du-hyun didn't look back. He climbed the final step and stood before the priest, who stared up at him in mute terror. Then, turning his head slightly, Du-hyun's voice rang out, clear and resonant, cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd like a blade. "This ceremony will not end in a scandal," Du-hyun declared, his hand coming to rest possessively on the small of Zara's back. "If the groom is too much of a coward to value what is standing before him, then I will take his place. I will marry her instead." The chapel erupted. A tidal wave of gasps and frantic whispers crashed against the vaulted ceiling. Zara felt the world tilt. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird seeking exit. She looked at the white roses in his hand, then up at the sharp, dangerous lines of his jaw. He was a lifeline made of iron, terrifying, unknown, but solid. "You don't even know me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing chaos. "I know you are being discarded in front of the world," Du-hyun replied, his dark eyes softening with a sliver of something that looked like respect. "And I know I am the only one here powerful enough to stop it. Give me your hand, Zara. Let's give them a different story to tell." Across the room, Andrew took a staggering step forward, his pride finally reacting to the sight of another man at his altar. "You can't do this. Who the hell are you?" Du-hyun didn't even turn around. He simply waited, his hand extended toward Zara, his palm open. It was a gamble, a leap into a dark abyss. Zara looked at Andrew's weak, panicked expression and then at the calm, absolute certainty in Du-hyun's gaze. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and pressed her hand into his. "Do it," she said, her voice growing stronger as she felt his fingers lock firmly around hers. As the priest stammered, trying to find his place in a script that had been rewritten in blood and ink, Du-hyun leaned in close to her ear. "Smart girl," he murmured. "Now hold your head up. From this moment on, you belong to the House of Cha." The heavy oak doors of the chapel swung open, venting the suffocating heat of the scandal into the crisp afternoon air. Du-hyun's grip on Zara's hand remained steady, a singular point of gravity as he led her down the stone steps toward a waiting fleet of black sedans. "Zara, stop!" The voice was thin and jagged. Andrew had scrambled out of the side exit, his tie lopsided and his face a frantic blotch of red and white. He looked diminished, the expensive tailoring of his suit now appearing like a costume that no longer fit. He lunged toward them, his desperation overriding his common sense. "You can't just walk away with him. I don't know who this freak is, but you're making a scene." Du-hyun stopped. He didn't flinch, didn't tighten his hold, and didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head, his gaze sliding toward Andrew with the clinical detachment of a man looking at a nuisance beneath his boot. In the sunlight, the sharp angles of Du-hyun's face were even more predatory. The light caught the edge of the tattoo on his neck, and for the first time the sheer, crushing weight of his aura hit Andrew full force. It wasn't just anger in Du-hyun's eyes. It was a terrifying, absolute absence of hesitation. "You were given an exit," Du-hyun said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "If you take one more step toward my wife, you will not like where that path ends." Andrew froze mid-stride. The bravado he had managed to muster vanished instantly, replaced by a primal, shaking terror. He looked at Du-hyun's calm, lethal eyes, and then at the two massive men in dark suits who had materialized silently behind the Mafia boss. Andrew's knees buckled. He didn't just stop. He recoiled, stumbling backward until he tripped over the curb, collapsing into a heap of humiliated silk and bruised pride. Zara watched from the safety of Du-hyun's side, her breath hitching in her throat. Seeing Andrew, the man she had once thought was her protector, cowering on the pavement like a broken child was a visceral shock. But it was the man holding her hand who truly frightened her. Du-hyun didn't gloat. He didn't even acknowledge Andrew's collapse further. He simply turned back to Zara, his expression shifting back to that mask of ironclad composure. "Get in the car, Zara," he murmured. As the door of the lead sedan was held open for her, Zara felt a dizzying mixture of fear and a dark, forbidden fascination. She was terrified of the power this man wielded, yet for the first time in her life, she felt entirely, dangerously untouchable. She stepped into the cool, leather-scented interior of the car, leaving the wreckage of her old life on the sidewalk behind them. The sedan glided through the city like a silent predator, the tinted windows offering Zara a distorted, darkened view of the world she used to know. Beside her, Du-hyun remained a statue of composure, his gaze fixed on the passing skyline. They didn't speak, but the air between them hummed with a heavy, electric tension. When the car finally pulled into the private underground terminal of a gleaming glass spire, the silence only deepened. The elevator ride was a dizzying ascent that ended in a soft chime. As the doors slid open, Zara stepped out into a space that redefined the meaning of wealth. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of polished obsidian floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down upon the city. As if it were a mere toy, it was breathtaking, but it lacked the warmth of a home. It felt like a fortress, curated and cold. "This is your home now," Du-hyun said, his voice echoing slightly in the vastness. Zara walked toward the glass, her reflection in her wedding gown looking like a ghost haunting a palace. "Who are you really?" she whispered, the question finally catching up to her. "The people at the church. They looked at you like they were seeing a demon." Du-hyun crossed the room, his movements fluid and purposeful. He stopped just behind her, his reflection looming over hers in the glass. "I am the man who keeps the wolves at bay, Zara. But to do that, one must be the most dangerous thing in the forest." He reached out, his fingers brushing the lace on her shoulder. "My business isn't found in boardrooms or spreadsheets. I deal in loyalty, in debts, and in the kind of power that doesn't ask for permission. Today, Andrew Lee didn't just walk away from you. He walked away from a debt he couldn't pay, and in his cowardice, he nearly left you as the collateral." Zara turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat. The subtle tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim architectural lighting. She saw the rows of monitors in the corner of the room, flickering with security feeds from every entrance, and the silent, armed men stationed at the elevators. This wasn't just a penthouse, it was a command center. She hadn't just been saved, she had been claimed by a man whose influence reached into the darkest corners of the city. As Du-hyun watched her, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. Zara realized with a jolt of both terror and awe that the gilded cage she had just entered was built to keep the world out and her in. "You're not just a businessman," she breathed. "No," he replied, his eyes darkening. "And you are no longer just a bride. You are a Cha. Get used to the weight of the name." The stillness of the penthouse was broken only by the soft click of Du Hyun's glass as he set it down on a marble console. He began to unbutton his suit jacket, shedding the formal layer to reveal the holster strapped beneath his arm and the full extent of the ink crawling up his throat. The transition from a polished groom to a commander of the underworld was seamless and terrifying. "You asked who I am," he said, his voice dropping into a register that felt like a low vibration in the floorboards. "I am the head of the Shin HWA syndicate. My business is the infrastructure of this city's shadows. I control the ports, the private debts, and the men who think they are above the law." He walked toward a wall that appeared to be solid wood, but with a touch of his palm, it slid back to reveal a hidden room lined with encrypted servers and weapons of precision. Andrew Lee didn't just owe money, Zara. He owed money to the Hwanguk, a rival faction that doesn't believe in interest rates. They believe in flesh. He offered you as a peace treaty to clear his ledger. He was going to let them take you from the reception. The blood drained from Zara's face, the silk of her dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. The betrayal was a physical ache, a cold blade twisting in her gut. She looked at Du Hyun, seeing the lethal reality of the man who had claimed her. "By taking your hand at that altar, I took on his debt," Du Hyun continued, stepping into her personal space. The scent of sandalwood and gunpowder clung to him. "And I took on their wrath. Every enemy I have is now looking at you as my greatest vulnerability. Your life as a civilian ended the moment you said do it in that chapel." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document, placing it on the edge of the mahogany desk. "This is an annulment. My lawyers have already signed it. I have a safe house in Singapore where you can disappear. You can leave tonight, and I will ensure you are never found by Andrew or the men he sold you to." Zara looked down at the paper, then back at the man who stood before her like a dark god of protection. If she signed, she would be safe, but she would be running, a victim forever looking over her shoulder. She looked at his steady hands, the calm power in his eyes, and the way he stood between her and the window as if shielding her from the city itself. She didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she took the document and tore it down the center, the sound of rending paper sharp in the quiet room. "I spent my life being what people expected me to be," Zara said, her voice finally losing its tremor. "And it led me to a man who tried to sell me. I'm done running, Du Hyun. If I have to be in a war, I'd rather be on the side of the man who actually showed up to fight for me." Du Hyun's eyes flared with a dark, appreciative heat. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders eased. "Then stay," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup the side of her neck, his thumb brushing over her pulse. "But remember, in my world there is no such thing as halfway." The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a gunshot or an intruder, but by the relentless, buzzing vibration of Zara's phone against the marble kitchen island. It was a digital stampede. Her screen was an endless scroll of blue bubbles and missed calls, her mother, her bridesmaids, her cousins, each notification a tiny explosion of judgment and panic. "Zara, what have you done? Come home this instant. Who is that man? The news says he's a criminal. You've ruined our family name. Andrew says he was threatened. Tell us you're safe." Zara stared at the glowing screen, her reflection mirrored in the black glass. Behind her, Du Hyun stood by the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the neon veins of the city. He didn't check his phone. He didn't have to. He was the one who controlled the noise. He wasn't its victim. The phone rang again. "Mother." Zara picked it up, her thumb hovering over the red icon. She remembered her mother's voice that morning, criticizing the fit of the dress, reminding Zara that the marriage to Andrew was a strategic necessity for their social standing. She remembered how no one had stepped forward when Andrew pulled the ring off her finger. They had all watched, phones raised, recording her destruction as if it were a spectator sport. "They want you to go back," Du Hyun said, his voice quiet but echoing in the vast space. He didn't turn around. They want you to return to the version of yourself they find comfortable, the one they can manage. They're ashamed, Zara whispered, the realization finally cooling the heat of her tears. They aren't worried about me. They're worried about how this looks at the country club. In my world, Du-hyun turned slowly, his mahogany eyes fixing on her with an intensity that felt more honest than anything she had ever known. Shame is a luxury. We only value what is real. Loyalty isn't a social contract, it's a blood oath. Zara looked at the phone one last time. A final text from her sister popped up. Think about your reputation, Zara. Andrew is willing to forgive you if you apologize now. The absurdity of it triggered a cold, sharp laugh in Zara's throat. Andrew, who had tried to sell her to pay a debt, was willing to forgive her. With a steady hand, she reached out and powered the device off. The screen went black, cutting off the tether to her old life. She walked across the polished floor toward the man in the shadows, her heavy silk train rustling behind her like a discarded skin. I spent my whole life trying to be valued by people who only loved my silence, she said, stopping inches from him. They don't want me back. They want their pawn back. Du-hyun reached out, his hand sliding into her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. And what do you want, Zara? I want to be the one who moves the pieces, she replied. He didn't smile, but a glint of something dark and proud ignited in his gaze. Then the ties are broken. From tonight, you answer only to me, and I answer only to you. The transition from victim to visionary began not with a romantic gesture, but with a strategy session. By the next morning, the penthouse had been invaded by a small, silent army of publicists and legal advisors, all moving with the same disciplined precision as Du-hyun's security detail. The world was still reeling from the footage of the stolen bride, and the headlines were predatory. We don't defend, Zara. We pivot, Du-hyun said, leaning against a mahogany table as a stylist draped a deep emerald silk over her shoulders. The color was bold, a sharp departure from the virginal white she had worn when her world ended. If we tell them it was a scandal, they will hunt you. If we tell them it was a coup de foudre, a lightning strike of love, they will envy you. Zara watched her reflection. The woman staring back looked different. The softness in her eyes was being replaced by a cool, calculating light. You want them to believe I planned this, that I left Andrew for you. I want them to know that you chose a king over a coward, he corrected, his gaze meeting hers in the mirror. We release the narrative that we have been seeing each other in secret, that you went to that altar out of duty, but when I appeared, you couldn't play the part anymore. It transforms your humiliation into a triumph of passion. Zara felt a thrill of cold clarity. It was a lie, but it was a powerful one. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting to the blows life dealt her. She was striking back. She spent the afternoon memorizing timelines and rehearsing the look, the way she was to lean into Du-hyun, the way she was to ignore the shouted questions of reporters with a secretive, knowing smile. As the first leaked photos of them dining on the penthouse balcony were prepared for release, Zara found herself suggesting a change. Don't release the photo of us holding hands, she said, her voice steady. Release the one where I'm looking at the camera and you're looking at me. It makes it clear that I'm not being led, I'm being worshipped. Du-hyun paused, a slow, dangerous smile finally tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen a flash of genuine warmth in his expression. You're a fast learner, Zara. I had a good teacher, she replied, adjusting the emerald sleeve. She was no longer just a woman who had been saved. She was becoming an architect of her own image, navigating the treacherous waters of Du-hyun's world with a new understanding. In the shadows, perception was the only currency that mattered, and she was about to become the richest woman in the city. The stillness of the penthouse was shattered at 3 a.m, not by a conversation, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a door and the scent of iron. Zara bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Du-hyun in the living room, leaning heavily against the obsidian counter. His charcoal shirt was unbuttoned, and a dark, wet stain was spreading across his side, blooming like a sinister rose against the fabric. Du-hyun, she gasped, rushing toward him. Stay back, Zara, he rasped, his jaw tight with a pain he refused to voice. It was just a reminder from the Hwanguk. They're getting desperate. She didn't listen. She stepped into his space, her hands trembling as she reached for the medical kit he had pulled from a hidden compartment. This was the man who had stood at the altar like an immovable god, the man who had rewritten her life with a single sentence. Seeing him bleed made the world feel fragile. "Sit down," she commanded. It was the first time she had ever used a tone of authority with him, and to her surprise, he obeyed, sinking onto a stool. As she cleaned the shallow graze along his ribs, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of two strategists at a chessboard. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of two people who had realized they were no longer alone. Zara's fingers brushed against the ink on his skin, tracing the dragon that disappeared into the bandage. "Why did you really do it?" she whispered, her eyes focused on her work so she wouldn't have to meet his gaze. "You could have paid Andrew's debt and left me to my fate. You didn't have to put a target on your own back." Du-hyun stayed quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his hand moved, his large, scarred palm covering hers, stopping her movements. He tilted his head up, and for the first time the Mafia boss was gone. In his eyes was a raw, aching honesty. "Because I spent my life watching people take what they didn't earn," he said, his voice a low, rough shadow of its usual self. "When I saw you standing there, being stripped of your worth by a man who wasn't fit to speak your name, I saw myself before the syndicate found me. I didn't marry you to settle a debt, Zara. I married you because for the first time in 10 years, I saw something in that church that was worth protecting." Zara felt the last of her own walls crumble. The transaction was dead. The whirlwind romance they had sold to the press was a lie, but the heat in her chest as she leaned forward to rest her forehead against his was terrifyingly real. "I'm not going anywhere," she breathed against his skin. Du-hyun's grip on her hand tightened, pulling her into the space between his knees. "I know," he murmured, his breath hitching as he finally let go of the control he had held since the day they met. In the quiet of the fortress, they were no longer a boss and a bride. They were two survivors finally finding home. The anniversary of the day her world ended began not with the flash of paparazzi bulbs, but with the soft, golden light of a sunrise over the Mediterranean. A year had passed since the scandal at the chapel, a year of learning the weight of a new name and the sharp, exhilarating reality of life at Du-hyun's side. The whirlwind romance they had manufactured for the public had long since dissolved into something far more quiet and infinitely more dangerous, the truth. They stood on the terrace of a secluded villa, the air smelling of salt and blooming jasmine. There were no cameras here, no security details standing within earshot, and no family members waiting to judge the optics of the moment. For the first time, there was no audience. Du-hyun leaned against the stone railing, his dark hair ruffled by the sea breeze. He had traded his charcoal suits for a simple white linen shirt, though the tattoo on his neck remained a permanent reminder of the world they would return to. He turned to look at Zara, his mahogany eyes searching hers with that same intensity that had once anchored her in the middle of a panic attack. "A year ago, I gave you a ring because it was a weapon," he said, his voice low and steady. "I gave it to you to stop the bleeding and to silence the people who wanted to see you fall. It was a contract, a transaction of protection." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, there was no oversized diamond meant to dazzle the press. Instead, it was a simple, elegant band of hammered gold, glowing with a warmth that matched the morning sun. "I told you then that there was no such thing as halfway in my world," he continued, stepping closer until the heat from his body shielded her from the wind. "But I also told you that I wanted you to choose. Today, the debts are paid. The Hwanguk are gone and Andrew Lee is a ghost. You don't need me to hide you anymore." He took the ring from the box and held it between them, his hand unshakable. "I'm not asking you to be a cha because you have nowhere else to go. I'm asking you to stay because I don't want to rule a city if you aren't the one standing at the other end of the table." Zara looked at the ring, then up at the man who had become her mentor, her protector, and finally her equal. A year ago, she had reached for his hand out of a desperate need to survive. Today, she felt the strength in her own fingers, a power she had forged in the shadows of his empire. She didn't hesitate. She reached out, sliding her hand into his, her fingers locking with his with the familiarity of a soul that had finally found its coordinate. "I'm not choosing a savior this time, Du Hyun," she whispered, a smile finally breaking across her face. "I'm choosing my partner." As he slid the gold onto her finger, the last remnants of the girl who had cried at the altar vanished. In her place stood a queen, finally home.